For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and socially. In the midst of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other than human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationship to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, and welcome to the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. This podcast is produced and made possible from supporters on Patreon. Thank you. If the podcast inspires you, gives you hope, or makes you think, please subscribe, share it on social media, and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. If you're new to rewilding or want to expand your perception of it, I recommend attending one of my Rewilding 101 workshops, which I offer both in person in Portland, Oregon, and online via Zoom for those who live around the world. You can check upcoming dates and register at rewildportland.com. The longer a culture exists in a place, the more stories they have of that place. These stories act as a way for people to interact with the land where they live and also act as social filters for how to perceive the land. Stories also engage people with the landscape through their imagination, and when linked to a physical activity, can make the connection more embodied and enjoyable. Humans learn through play, and playing with stories can be a great way to reconnect ourselves with the landscape and its inhabitants. To talk with me about this on the podcast is a returning guest, Jason Godesky. Jason is an independent tabletop role-playing game designer and world builder. He and his wife, Giulianna Lamanna, are the creators of The Fifth World, an open-source shared universe that imagines what the future that we in the rewilding community want could look like. Jason, thank you for coming on to the Rewilding podcast for a second time.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we're going to be talking about storytelling and the significance of storytelling, as well as sort of how that plays into, I don't really like the word gamification,
Right.
but I feel like that's part of the storytelling process. Like, I feel like there's two elements, right? Like if you look at Joseph Campbell, there's like mythology and then enactment. And those two things are sort of like two sides of the same coin. So when I think about like the importance of storytelling, I also think of like well, what is the application of that? I think like gamification is kind of a word that maybe encompasses both of those things together. I don't know. What do you think
Yeah.
about that?
The term gamification has been used by the worst people on the planet to mean very slimy engagement tactics. But the actual word itself, beyond the connotations, does kind of get at some of the what I consider to be one of the bright shining hopes for rewilding. I tell people that sometimes people say like the more you know, the more depressed you'll be. And I tell people that the more I've learned, the more I've been on a roller coaster ride. And this is a prime example because you learn about the power of oral tradition and the way that it forms sustainable cultures, help and connects them to the land in a way that is sustainable for people and for the more than human world that they're enmeshed in. And then you think about how much we've lost in losing our oral traditions and having that, and how much that has played a role in losing our the normal that natural wild human condition that rewilding is all about returning to. And it can seem overwhelming. That's the depressing part of this roller coaster, because you think that is such an enormous loss. How could we ever possibly get that back? It'll take tens of thousands of years to get back there. But then I am a huge nerd and I play tabletop role-playing games. And the thing that I have noticed there, and I did not expect to find salvation and hope in something as stupid as tabletop role-playing games, but it's there. It is the best engine that I have, far more than I ever could have expected to exist, for generating an authentic, or at least the seeds of an authentic oral tradition. So I've been working on this game called The Fifth World. It's all about imagining what a rewilding future could look like. So you take it and you imagine what it would look like where you live. And I live in Pittsburgh, which is defined by these three rivers. There's two rivers that converge to form the Ohio. And so we had a scene that had the ferryman who lives at in this particular tunnel on the southern shore of the Monongahela River, and he would take people across the river. And this convergence of three rivers was like the gateway to the underworld. It was this, like, it had this significance of, the river flows into the west towards the setting sun, and the fountain at the point is like connecting to the depths of the earth. And so this ferryman was a very Charon-like figure who would ferry people who were making a pilgrimage to that site to make offerings to loved ones who had passed. And after doing this, my friends, when they passed through that tunnel, would talk about the ferryman who takes you to the land of the dead. And so now we had this connection to a place through story that gave it that tuned us into what that place was about, right? And so it became a practice of listening to the place and what does the place have to tell you, what does it resonate with, and trying to weave that into stories that connect us to it.
It's interesting too because yeah, and it makes me think of the book Wisdom Sits in Places, which is anthropology of Apache place name stories. So it goes through how these different particular stories called place name stories connect people to their place. They're called chronotopes, where time and space intersect. And what's interesting to me about what you're doing and is that in the Apache culture, it was like this, and it is still today, they still practice these. They're historical accounts. Some of them are historical accounts. Some of them are like mythological accounts. And what's interesting, I think, about like Fifth World is that it's like a futuristic account in a way. Like it's like instead of projecting into the past, it's projecting into the future and then trying to like actualize that or moving forward toward those goals. And I think that's like super interesting.
I have certainly noticed that I really do believe that one of the big challenges that we face is that we don't have a positive vision of the future to move towards. We don't really believe, or at least most of us don't really believe in the techno-utopian scientific, we'll all live in city spaceships in the future vision. And I think that the number of dystopias that you see in media is a symptom or an indicator of that, right? I think people are hungry for a new vision of the future that is both believable and optimistic.
Totally.
So that's what we've been working on.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because like I just downloaded, one of my favorite games is Last of Us, which of course is a dystopian future zombie apocalypse. And then I recently got, yeah, it's an amazing game. But then I recently got Cyberpunk 2077 just to try it out, just because I'm, curious about it. And what's funny to me about that game is that as I'm playing it, first of all, it's just sort of like Grand Theft Auto meets Deus Ex, and I hate Grand Theft Auto, and I like Deus Ex, so I hate the parts of Cyberpunk 2077 that are like Grand Theft Auto. But the weird part is like as I played it, I was kind of like I get bored mostly with video games now. I just have a hard time connecting with them at all. I think that they're, I'd rather just go on a walk or something, but when it's rainy and all the things and I'm bored and apathetic and sometimes I just need to get away from everything, I'll still like use video games as a sort of playground to just not necessarily escapism, but just maybe escapism on a level. But as I was playing it, I was like, we already live in a cyberpunk dystopia. Like we exist in this. Like I'm checking, like, in fact, this cyberpunk dystopia is not as bad as the one we live in right now. Like there are, like, in terms of surveillance, this is one of the things I was thinking about, is I was like, in the game, you can like, use your whatever to hack into a camera and like turn it off. And I'm like, but in reality, like there are fucking cameras everywhere now. And there's no way to like, it's just interesting to think about like the ways that people were envisioning some sort of future are like not as bad as the one that we actually just live in today.
My wife is currently working on an anthology, or not an anthology of short. No, I guess she was very specific about how an anthology is different writers. So it's a collection of short stories, and each short story. So the first story takes place 30 years from now. The next one is 30 years after that. It's all in the same place here in Carrick, where the neighborhood where we live, and it's going generation by generation from now into the fifth world. Because we get a lot of people who are like, I don't see how we could possibly just abandon technology. Like, well, not all at once, that's for sure.
Right. Yeah.
And so it follows the process in a way that's like each one feels like the inevitable consequence of the one before, but then you stack them all together, and after 14 chapters, we're in a rewilding paradise.
Nice.
But one of the things that has gone into that is the stressing about how do you predict the future accurately. And the thing that I keep coming back to in our discussions about that is it is going to be better and worse than you imagine.
Right.
Yeah. It'll be worse, but also more boring.
Right. Exactly.
Totally in the most boring ways. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But also there will be the opportunities open up. Power is more restricted over time. The ability to project power diminishes. So like I have told people, I've made this prediction in the past that we probably will have a time when the United States government is down to executing people for eating their salad with their dinner fork.
Right.
But that'll probably be about the same time that they have a hard time getting their army all the way to Virginia Beach.
Totally. Right. Yeah. It makes me think of the collapse of complex societies. He talks about the Roman Empire, and by the end of the Roman Empire, taxes were so high on farms that farmers were just like, fuck this, and joining the barbarians, so-called barbarians, because it was more lucrative and you had less, or you had more freedoms and all this stuff to just no longer be paying into this empire, and they can't exist without their taxes. And so it just became, it was like inflation, all the things, they like had to keep jacking the taxes up just to stay afloat because of diminishing returns. But then that was too much for everybody. And, there was like a while back, I posted this meme on Instagram that was like, how to rewild yourself or whatever. And one of the and it was a bunch of different things. And one of them was stop paying taxes. And people were like, oh, what do you mean we have to stop paying taxes? And I was like, no, I don't mean like necessarily right now, but there will be a time where everybody's like, we can't do this anymore, and they stop. And it's like that's the point, right?
Yeah.
And that's a prediction. We don't know when that's going to happen or how or whatever, but that's like most likely a probable future for all states.
It's one of those diagnostic things, right? Where you always have people who just don't pay their taxes.
Yeah.
When they don't come for you when you don't pay your taxes, it's when you know where you are in the process.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you mentioned earlier, right at the beginning about what we lost with with losing oral traditions, and that's kind of an interesting thing because I didn't really think about that in terms of like tabletop storytelling gameplay. So I'm curious if you want to touch on that a little bit more. Like what about oral tradition is like wild or what element of wildness is oral tradition, and how did we lose that?
So you already mentioned wisdom sits in places. I've got a book over here in this bookshelf behind me called If This Is Your Land, Then Where Are Your Stories? Which is named for, like, it's this anthropologist who was challenged with that question at a meeting with some indigenous folks where he was rolling out whatever the government program was, and one of the elders asked him, if this is your land, where are your stories?
Wow.
Because in their tradition, and in a lot of indigenous traditions, it's the stories that tie people to land. You think of like the way that the dreaming in Australia ties people to places. The way that like an individual, we usually think of bands of hunter-gatherers in Australian Aboriginal culture as roaming about trying to get food. That's not really how they think of themselves. They think of themselves as these individuals, like a place has a song, and you have to have the right to sing that song. But if there's not someone, but if you know the song, you have an obligation to sing that song, because if somebody doesn't sing that song, the place dies. And so you are this supernatural custodian of a place tied to the creation of the world, given these supernatural rights, but also responsibilities to keep the world alive and keep creation going. And your band is less about how do we get food than these are the this is the league of superheroes that I am a member of, because we are all charged with keeping alive places that are nearby here. So we have banded together in our great mission. That is, you think about the deep need for meaning. Compare bullshit jobs of the modern world to that.
Right. Yeah.
And that's an over. I feel like it is a fair generalization. Yes, people are right to not generalize about indigenous cultures. The main things they have in common are the ways in which they are not us, which is like that it's a negative definition. So of course, they represent almost all the diversity in the human experience.
It's
But one of the ways
interesting.
in which they're not like us is they understand the deep-seated need for for meaning in human life, and they find that in a connection to a more than human world.
It's interesting that you say that, because it makes me think of um, the complexity and diversity of hunter-gatherers, right? And when I interviewed Leonard Martin and his whole thing about like immediate return hunter-gatherers don't really have much stories. They don't really have much of a need to have a sense of purpose and these kind of things. And it makes me think about the delayed return response, and how I think I think stories are a kind of technology. I think animism is also a kind of technology
For
that
sure.
integrates delayed return societies back into a relationship that they had more or less as immediate return hunter gatherers, if that makes any sense. Like, I feel like, if you make a mistake in the landscape and you're a conscious animal that can like interpret these mistakes and then come up with a language that communicates those, then you can like build a story around that. And I think with immediate return societies, there was just so minimal of an impact on an environment that there wasn't really, and because they were hypermobile, there weren't really like mistakes or limits to growth that were like breached, or there was a minimal overshoot probably in immediate return societies, because if you consume resources, then you can migrate to another location. And even then, who knows? I'm sure that there's lots of different immediate return societies that have stories that could
Right.
connect them to place as well, right? But like, one of the things that Leonard Martin was talking about was like this. There were 4 examples in one of the books that he looked at where they didn't believe in ancestors or afterlife, and they didn't really
Sure.
even talk about it. And when asked about meaning and stuff like that, they were just like living in the present moment, just allegedly from
Right.
this interpretation, right? So I mean, I just think it's really cool, because and if this is true, if um storytelling is a kind of technology that can then integrate us into place, it kind of wraps back towards my um initial inspirations by Daniel Quinn and Joseph Campbell, that if we change our story, we really can have a bigger impact on our ability to live without exceeding the limits to growth. I've become more or less a materialist
Oh
over
no,
the
I'm a
years.
hardcore materialist. Yes,
I
I
know
think
you
that
as
we make
well.
up the stories.
Yeah.
If,
But we
if
have
you
to
have
have those.
right,
We have to
and
have the stories.
the stories are in competition just like anything else in evolution, right?
Totally.
If you tell a story about restraint, and I tell a story about rampant growth and my destiny to rule the universe, and the resources exist to be taken advantage of, I am going to steamroll you,
Yeah.
because my story says grow, and I'm going to get big enough to steamroll you.
Yeah.
This doesn't necessarily mean that that my story is better, more true, that I am a superior society. It just means that I have a lot of people, and a lot of people can kill a smaller number of people,
Right.
which wasn't a
Yeah.
great breakthrough in intellectual discourse.
No. It also kind of makes me think about the difference between, or rather, the material reality that led towards, theoretically, that led towards egalitarian societies. I don't know if, Christopher Bame's like projectile weapons theory about how competition between males and people within society essentially was diminished because you could just shoot somebody with a poisoned arrow, or give them a mortal wound, and like you didn't have to be stronger than anybody once we had weapons to do so. And so it encouraged people to collaborate together and build coalition to basically stop murderers or the people who would maybe become or try to impose their authority on other people. And then at some point, within the so-called agricultural revolution, it then switched and the material realities became possible through that subsistence model to
Right.
grow and expand and create and build up hierarchy. And so, both of these stories exist, but then the material realities underneath them lend themselves to a certain thing,
Right.
which is kind of a bummer to bring up during this conversation of about stories in the future. But if we look at, again, the diminishing returns, the inevitability of that, and the inevitable decline of our society, that's the inevitable material loss of the
Yeah.
ability for, oil economy at least, industrial economy at least, to maintain this reality.
Exactly. We're reaching, and I think that is the underlying reality behind why we no longer believe in those visions and stories that we used to. We're seeing materially that they're not working out. The
Totally.
material conditions that made the story "I should grow forever and conquer the universe" has shifted, and so there are people who have told our story before. They got crushed. They are the losers of history, and it's hard to. They're little footnotes scattered throughout history because they were crushed. But they were crushed because that was the material momentum of their time. And it might still be too early for us, but it's also getting to the point where it might not be. And if there's not a story ready to go when that dynamic shifts, things get a lot worse. Finding the story to make sense of how chaotically the world is changing, I think, is going to be a bigger challenge in the collapse of civilization than material needs.
Totally. Yeah. Well, and it's it's not that there will be a shortage of stories, right? It's that which story
Right.
is actually going to be the ones that soften the decline for everybody.
Is it a story that actually works?
Yeah.
There's a million stories, but there's like
Yeah.
five that actually fit these
Yeah.
conditions. So
Totally. I mean, and to actually voice what I'm talking about. I'm talking about fascism, right? Like that's one of the
yeah.
potential stories, and so it's one of those things that we have to actually have ready to go. We have to
Mm-hmm.
be talking about. This is why again the population conversation that we had previously. This territory that those other stories are claiming as their own and then twisting for their own nefarious purposes or their own racist ideologies or things like
Right.
that. Like we have to be able to take the terrain of story across the board of all these things that may be too challenging for most people to try to wade into anymore and claim that space back for
Right.
egalitarianism and anti-racist, anti-fascist ideology.
Exactly.
Um,
And
yeah.
I'm not enough of an optimist to think that we'll stop them completely.
Oh,
Certainly,
absolutely not.
given that they have already succeeded in many regards,
Absolutely
it's
not.
too late for that. But
Totally.
but we do need to do everything that we can.
Yeah.
I often quote this piece from the Talmud. You are not obligated to finish the work, but neither are you free to desist from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 100%. This makes me think of another like challenge with building stories into a landscape is, I think a long time ago I started to come up with place name stories. And I mean, I've been part of Portland for my whole life. My
Mm-hmm.
great great grandfather moved here in 1880. So I have like places all over town that my family has told me stories about. So I have like my familial place names that are disassociated from the indigenous population's place names
Mm-hmm.
of things, right? Because mine are all post colonial place names or place stories, chronotopes. I love that word, mostly because it's similar to Chrono Trigger, which was one of my favorite video games as a child.
Other.
I love time travel, so the idea of like time traveling in your mind in a space to see different stories, both past. That's why I like the Fifth World because it's like a future time travel, whereas most of the
Mm-hmm.
other ones are past time travels. Um, but it's interesting, like coming across this challenge of like if I'm creating a story here in my own little pocket of community and I'm not really fully associated with the indigenous people here, like where is the and this might just be the challenge of population numbers and population pressures and different historical aspects of colonialism and racism, but like I'm an optimist and I'm a idealist, And so in my mind, it's like, I just want everybody to get along and envision a future together and like embrace aspects of cultural tradition that are of this place. And then also envision like, but also being forward, being open to like envisioning new stories, right? And I don't know if that's actually possible. I don't know if any of these communities, like indigenous people here, are, at least in an institutional way, which maybe that's the problem, are like collectively envisioning new possibilities of like, in a after, post collapse, will there still be this distinction between like settlers and indigenous people in this diaspora of like post-colonial society, right? Like I don't, and maybe we don't have the answer to that, but it's something that comes up when I think about dreaming into the future, especially with
Yeah.
place names, because some of those places already have names and already have stories. And it's like, this is why I started learning Chinook Wawa at the Confederate Tribes of Grand Ron, was to sort of like make an interface there. And I feel like I've made it on some individual level, but when it comes to like a broader, bigger cultural context, I haven't even scratched the surface of like going
Right.
forward, And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that stuff.
Learning the indigenous language of the place where you live is an incredibly good thing. You should do that. You should learn the place names. You should learn the stories that are already associated with it. But they're not your stories. Those stories come from a relationship that they had with the land, and it's the same place. It's like my relationship with you versus my wife's relationship with you. She doesn't have the same relationship. Like she,
Yeah,
you have
yeah.
your relationship with her, you have your relationship with me. We're two different people. We have different relationships. If she were to just try to like take my relationship with you, that would be wrong. Uh, so it's you can't just go in and take indigenous people's relationship to these places. You have to form your own relationship with these places. Um, and that I think that is the underlying thing that drives civilization to destroy the world is we don't have a relationship with places. When we did, when you say we're gonna remove this mountaintop to dig out all the coal, uh, you don't get a lot of people standing up like, no, I love this mountain. This mountain is important to me. I have a relationship with this mountain, and they come out to defend that mountain like they would their children. You do have some, and the fact that like you have those people in West Virginia speaks to the way that you do form a relationship with a place just by living there, no matter
Mm-hmm.
what. So we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about when I talk about the power of games, I'm talking about an accelerant to a natural human process that happens already. As far as the future, that's one that we think about a lot with the Fifth World, and it's not my story to tell. That's one of the reasons we make it open source so that other people can come in. I recall, didn't Chief Jake Swamp before he passed talk a bit about Europeans who want to abandon civilization could one day be welcomed as a seventh nation of the Haudenosaunee.
I didn't hear
Like
that, but that would be awesome if you did say
I,
that.
I think
Yeah.
I, I think I heard him talking about that
Uh,
at one time. Maybe I'm wrong.
mm-hmm.
Um, like
It
that's the
sounds
thing
like
about
something he would say from my experience of hearing him talk, but
yeah. That's the thing about the Tree of Peace. It's supposed to be
mm,
like anybody who's willing to abide by the law comes to the Tree of Peace. The Haudenosaunee have adopted other nations before, like the Tuscarora, if they're willing to join. If Europeans are willing to set aside their idea of being masters of everything and live according to the law, maybe they could be
mm-hmm.
adopted. That's not for me to decide. That's for Haudenosaunee people to decide. That's for them. That's their story to tell. Um, and I would the distinction between colonist and settler still continue. I think that we focus on colonial and settler because the injustices continue. And
Mm-hmm.
if the colonial system breaks apart, the injustices aren't continuing. I have a lot of Irish ancestors, but I'm not oppressed at all.
Mm-hmm.
That
Mm-hmm.
disappeared in like 2 generations. Like 400 years of oppression disappeared overnight because the chain of transmission was broken.
Mm-hmm.
If you break that chain of transmission, there's no reason to tell that story anymore. So I can we haven't really delved into it, but we've talked about like different peoples in the Fifth World where everybody's descended from everybody. Everybody has indigenous heritage. Everybody has colonial heritage, because people fall in love and they have babies. You can't stop them. And but then the story that you tell is about what you focus on. Do you focus on, we are the descendants of the indigenous people who survived, even though we have all of these colonial ancestors, and that's just a detail? Or do you focus on, we're the descendants of these colonists who damn near destroyed the earth and turned back from the brink to survive, because the ones who didn't aren't around, don't have kids around to tell those stories. And oh yeah, we also have a bunch of indigenous ancestors, but that's a detail, right? It's the story that you focus on is going to dictate a lot about how you see yourself and how you see your relationship with the world and with other groups around you.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I think too, you know, when you were talking about the place in Pittsburgh now where your friends and you, when you drive by, you think of the story, right? And in terms of Apache place names, that was like the idea. Their social constructs were all tied to specific places, so that when people were traveling through there, they couldn't help but think about the social things that made them Apache or whatever, right? Like this is where this thing happened that gave us this taboo or this particular cultural agreement, you know, over sharing or certain things like that in different elements of the landscape. In going to the tribal office in Portland and learning Chinookwawa and learning the mythology of the place, you know, there are animals that live here that are heavily featured. While the places are sort of ambiguous at this point, there are a few like obvious places. The animals are the things that sort of persist through time, because they're not linked specifically to a specific place as much as they're linked to the ecosystem as a whole that we exist in. And, you know, there's so wintertime is storytelling time here in the Northwest, and for a lot of different tribes, including the Chinook. And they did these translations a couple of years ago of what they call blue jay, but is like a Steller's jay or a scrub jay. The myths of the scrub jay, and it's this thing where it's like a very there's lots of comedy in there, and there's also very dark. Like a lot of the Chinookan tales here are like Grimm's fairy tales or like Hans Christian Andersen. Like there's a lot of violence and death, and also a lot of comedy. And so case, which is or keese, case, kind of the same thing. It's sort of the onomatopoeia of a scrub jay sound or a Steller's jay sound. Is the name of it in Chinookwawa, and the character is so like sticky or like memorable and impactful that like every time I see that bird now, I see case from the stories. And so I just want to say that while they're not like the stories of my ancestors hereditarily, I think that there's a cross-cultural pollination that happens that is beyond just like what we accept today as like inheritable through bloodlines and history. Like, you know, you could indigenous societies before colonization didn't really operate on that. Some of them did. I think anybody that had land holdings in hierarchical sedentary cultures, hereditary, you know, bloodlines are the ones where you find the most importance, right?
Suddenly, genealogy is very important when there's land on the line.
Yeah. But in the more nomadic societies, you know, with less hierarchies, the less it matters where your bloodline goes and what's coming to you and what culture you belong to. The lines of culture are so much more blurry. And so I think about that with this kind of thing too, is like, while I'm not adopted into some other tribe, I don't want to be. I'm not asking for that. I'm okay with being, you know, whatever, a cultural mishmash of things, and trying to respect all of the different aspects of my own ancestry as well as those that exist around me. I'm still like being incorporated into the language culture at Grand Ronde, where now I am seeing those places and those creatures that are in those stories through a newer lens, and through a lens that's connected me more to place and also to the people here. Another example is I did a translation there years ago of the raccoon and his grandmother's story. And I think this story is illustrative of why it's important to do this in tandem with the indigenous people of your place, and not through like a dictionary Like, don't try to learn a language through dictionary. Actually go to the tribal language communities and try to learn from them. And not to like acquire the language, but to become part of the place, right? Like, I think that's the other element of like learning an indigenous language is don't take the language, learn the language to become part of the place and part of the people, an
Mhm.
extension of those people's culture, right? So in that sense, it's like you were saying, everybody has a different relationship towards me as a person, but then also there's still a relationship there. And I think that's what's important is that the relationship exists. It's not just like you're reading about somebody on Wikipedia and studying them from afar, but you actually know the person, you're talking to them,
Right.
you hang out with them occasionally or whatever, right? Like there's a relationship there. It's not just like extraction from a distance.
Right. I think that is a thing that is not evenly distributed across Turtle Island.
Totally.
Uh, so the Mississippian world, what archaeologists call the Mississippian world, we don't really know what they called themselves because smallpox got to
Mm-hmm.
them way before Europeans did.
Mm-hmm.
Like some Europeans down in the Gulf of Mexico met some people. They transmitted smallpox to some people who transmitted smallpox. And so smallpox got into this densely populated, continent wide trade network that was truly an incredible, if we're talking about complex societies, this is, truly defies the European conception of they're all savages.
Right.
Um, but it tears through the whole network because they're densely populated and have lots of trade links. And so when the Europeans reach the Mississippian world, which let's be clear, that's most of the geographic area of the United States. I'm in Pittsburgh, so I'm on the edge of what was the Mississippian world.
Mm.
And so land acknowledgements in Pittsburgh are kind of tricky.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people will bring up the nativelands.ca website and say, oh, they're Haudenosaunee, which is going to be a real disappointment to the Mingo,
Right.
who are an Iroquoian speaking people who very deliberately decided to not join the Longhouse and had some fights over that. But the people who were here, they might be related to the Kickapoo. They might be related. They might be related to a couple different groups that have been displaced and moved west. Um, but then the Haudenosaunee came down and claimed it. There were some other groups around. The Shawnee were moving around. The Lenape were being pushed west. So, do the Haudenosaunee are the Haudenosaunee the indigenous people of the Three Rivers because they got here a hot minute before the English? So, and if I
Totally.
acknowledge if I acknowledge it as Haudenosaunee land, am I pissing off the Mingo? I,
Yes.
I
Right.
feel like I should not be making a claim in this
Yes, 100%.
in
It's
this area,
actually,
right?
I think it's the same in most, I would say most urban cities, because
Yeah,
that's where most different tribes interacted and overlap, because the
right,
cities were built literally in the same place. They were built on top of these overlapping
right.
complex trade locations and village sites.
Which can like there's a Three Rivers Indians Council in Pittsburgh because there are some native people here, but there's not a lot, and they're not necessarily from tribes that lived here.
Mm-hmm.
So
Totally.
having the connection to indigenous people of your area can be complicated
Yeah.
in a lot of the country,
Right. Yeah.
and so it's if you can, you absolutely should. I
Right.
agree with that.
Yeah.
Um, and you should support native populations just because they're people who
Totally.
are in need and they need
Yes.
help.
100%.
But I don't. I think like I do try to learn what I can from the Haudenosaunee, but I also understand that their connection to this place is probably not. It's not like the Chinookwa in Portland.
Yeah. Well, and Chinook Wawa is unique because it was a trade language. So it's
Right.
technically the language of the whole Northwest. Um, it was not a mother tongue. The reason why Grand Ron still speaks it and has not broken a chain is because there were 26 different tribes brought to the Grand Ron Reservation from all over Oregon, and that was their common language. And so it's not
What
a
else are you going to ask when there's 20? What else are you going to say when there's 26 different
exactly.
tribes?
And they kind of creolized there and they kept it alive. So they have a lot of like ownership and they're very protective and defensive about it because it's their heritage language at this point in time. But 100 years ago, 200 years ago, it was the lingua franca of the entire Northwest. And
Right.
so in that sense, no one owns it, it's all these things. It's like Quechua or Swahili, it's that
Right.
kind of thing where it's like a geographic and cross-cultural language. So it's a little easier. It's not like I'm learning Chinook proper, which would be really cool. It's very like guttural. It sounds kind of like Klingon or something like that. When you hear it, it's real. I love it. It's one of my favorite languages. But
I have tried to learn a little bit of Mingo, but it's really hard to find good
yeah,
resource.
yeah.
I learned how to say hello,
Mm-hmm.
but there's
Yeah,
so little else to go much past that. And frankly, if you can't get past that, you can't use it. If you can't use it, I forgot how to say
totally.
hello
Yeah,
too.
right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think there's other ways of, connecting besides language as well. But it's just one of those things to like put out there when we're talking about generating place names and
Hmm.
growing new roots into this place is like there are people with roots here
Hmm.
and attempting to interface with those people and their roots in a collaborative way that is
Yeah.
assisting, but also allowing for something new to come out of that, I think is
Yeah.
like where
I
where I think about how to storify the landscape.
Yeah, for sure. I see it through that lens of they have their relationship to the place, and I'm trying to form my relationship to the
Mm-hmm.
place. So, their stories, their place names can, because it's coming from their relationship to the same thing, I can maybe learn something about that place. And then I can try to use that understanding in developing my own relationship with that
Totally.
place.
Yeah. I've also come across the reason why I bring it up at all is because I've come across people who are like, no, these are the stories of this place. Our stories are the stories, and you have to learn these stories, or you're just
Sure.
a neo colonist or whatever, right? And so this is where I'm like, okay, well, stories change, and
Yeah.
like how we're and that's okay. Like I'll learn the stories of this place as well as
Right.
create the other ones. But this is where I feel like there's an institutional level of state society that then permeates through all of the different subcultural aspects of it. Whereas, like in a collapse scenario, no one's going to give a shit about any of this stuff. And
Right.
we're going to be making connections and interconnections based on stories and how we can collaborate. And
Right.
if everybody's like, no, you have to do it this specific way, that's a barrier to those futuristic collaborations.
Yeah. I get where they're coming from because
100%.
colonialism and imperialism is
100%.
is what we live under, right?
Yes.
And in that
Yes.
context, you're not wrong.
Right. Exactly.
But if you were to take that, if you were to really take that, what you're, unless you're willing to adopt all the white people into your tribe, and
Right.
we can all learn your language, and we can all use those stories, we can all call ourselves, and we're all, you're willing to just make us all members of your tribe, which is generally not what they want. I've rarely heard that
Yeah.
as a
Right.
thing that is aspired to. Then you're leaving us in a position where we have to be despoilers, we have to be destroyers. So what is the way out?
Exactly. Yeah.
Either we become not despoilers, or we're talking like a for real genocide, not this pansy white genocide where people fall in love and have babies, and oh no, there's no white people one day.
Right.
Sounds cool to me. Um, what do I care if there's people with skin the color
100%.
of
Yeah. Who
unbaked
gives a
cookie dough?
shit? Who gives a shit?
Um,
Yeah.
but either we find a way to live in the world without destroying it, or we all die. So
Yeah.
those are the only
Yeah.
options.
It's true. Yeah. So anyway, those are some of the like the hard questions, the hard problems that we have to navigate as, you know, people living on not the traditional lands that
I
of our own ancestors.
I do suspect that part of that question may be based in an assumption that civilization could be sustainable, and why don't we just go
Totally.
off and do our thing?
Yes.
If that were a possibility, there would be a third way out, but
Totally.
that's not a possibility.
No, it's not. Yeah, I think and I think that is true. Most people kind of have this
Yeah.
perception that this is going to keep going on
Hmm.
some level, and it might for a while. But like, what we're trying to do is envision something else, envision a future through the demise of civilization or of
Yeah.
the different states that exist today.
The oppression and destruction aren't bugs in the system; they are the
Right.
system.
Exactly. Yeah. Um, so I want to turn it back towards more of like the storytelling aspect of things.
Yeah.
And how do you see, you said that role-playing games can be an accelerant for something that is, I'm going to paraphrase in my own words, something
Sure.
innate in humans, right? Like innate aspect of telling stories. So like, what are the accelerant, like how do you see it acting as an accelerant?
So, like I said, if you live in a place, you're going to notice things about the place. You're going to, and you're going to incorporate that into a idea of what that place is like. That idea of what that place is like is a story that you're telling yourself. The story of the land is the emergent story that comes from all of those stories coming together. Um, and that happens no matter what. That happens just living in a place. Like you living in a place, you see things, and you don't just hold them in your brain as separate points of data. You string them together into a narrative of what that means. Um, and I think that could be as from something as basic as tracking. Like we don't see a track, a track, a track. We put them together into a narrative of an animal came through here. It broke that leaf. It broke that stem. It ate that leaf. It dropped that turd, and it kept on down to the river. Um, and we kind of apply that to other things. Like we want to put together the story of this place. When you sit, well, not necessarily all role playing games. Like if you play Dungeons and Dragons and you're talking about a fantasy world, it's not gonna help you with this. But it will. That will create stories that bind you together as a group, and you'll have this kind of um, oral tradition that you're forming of the experiences that you had in your fantasy adventures, and that alone is important because you have this group, and groups tend to be more egalitarian than nations or committees or councils, and that can be a great foundation for um, making anarchist action and building larger anarchist um, coalitions. Um, when you put it in the real world, you have an extra element that binds it to places, um, and so you're telling the stories about these places, and so you're spending your recreational time really thinking about what does it mean. So instead of just I made these observations and over enough time these observations fall into place, the game becomes a reason to go make more observations. It becomes a reason to thread things together. And I should like it's easy to like I don't want to oversell it, right? If oral tradition, if an indigenous oral tradition is um, a giant stack of gold bars, then uh, then a role playing game is a way to stamp out a one gold coin. And so like you're getting started, right? You're not taking somebody else's stories, you're creating your own stories, but you can be at a pace of I'm going to create one new story every week, as opposed to we create one new story every year. Instead of taking 10,000 years to develop an oral tradition, you could do it in one human lifetime, and have a start at least.
Yeah, it's cool. I like the layering of making it in the real physical world, or at least, even if it's a futuristic scenario, it's still like here in the place where you are. It makes me think of Rewild Portland. Before we were Rewild Portland, technically our name on paper is Myth Media.
Mm.
And we ran when I was 17, I started doing this film screening in town. It was like an open mic style film screening. Eventually, other people picked up and started doing this, and they were called micro cinemas. But I was a pioneer of the micro cinema. When I was doing it, it did not have a name. And it was because I was a dropout who wanted to keep telling stories and making films and showing them to people. And YouTube did not exist. So where were you going to show your stories? Or even if you posted it to YouTube, all you'd get was somebody, writing a disparaging comment on it, 3
Right.
views or something, right? Because this was when YouTube was just being born. This is in like the late 90s, right? YouTube really took off in the early aughts, but yeah, you didn't have anywhere to show it if you weren't in school or didn't have a theater. So we did this open mic style film screening, and I kept trying to add layers to connect it more to the place and seasonality and things like that. And so we ended up holding it on the full moon of every month so that people would like start to notice what the
Right.
phase of the moon was in.
Right.
And just to see if that would be a thing that people would notice, and it was like, I remember people being like, oh, Peter, I saw the moon was almost full. And I was like, oh, it's almost time for broadcast, which was we called it broadcast. Um, and of course, that was actually really fucking challenging to do, because trying to get a venue on a random day every month without
Hmm.
that consistency, with the Gregorian calendar and the work
Right.
week and all that shit, it was just basically too hard. So we had to stop doing that because not enough people could get that. People were scrambling to get time off to show up and all this different stuff. Um,
Yeah. So World of Darkness has a setting for werewolf, which is their most environmentalist version, where the werewolves are basically eco-terrorists who go destroy corporations and do
wow.
industrial sabotage. It's pretty awesome. So I ran a werewolf game where we did like whatever phase of the moon. We didn't set it so it was always on the full moon, but we did do the phase of the moon that it actually is when
Mm.
we sit down to play
Mm-hmm.
would amplify some of your powers and diminish
Amazing.
other of your
Yes.
powers. And something like that gets you
Mm-hmm.
in tune to
Yeah.
natural rhythms that are
Yeah.
otherwise easy to miss.
Mm-hmm.
Eat, having seasonal foods for when you get together for a
Mm-hmm.
game
Mm.
gets you to appreciate the taste. Like if you can have local and seasonal. If they're local, it's almost certainly going to be seasonal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you get this feeling of the taste of your
Mm.
place
Mm.
through the year, how it tastes in spring, how it tastes in summer, how it tastes in fall, how it tastes in the winter. So you can layer those things on.
Yeah, that's
Even
awesome. Um, yeah, there's like a thing in the Where Are Your Keys language learning game, a technique that they call do food, which is basically like every time you have a gathering of any kind, make sure that there's food for people. Like
Mhm.
that's like the primacy of human connection. No of the other apes really share their food. Humans are unique in the like, obviously I think chimps have
Yeah,
been seen to share their food every once in a while, but it's like a big deal when they actually do it. And it's usually like a mom and her baby or something. It's
right.
generally not, aside from bonobos, which definitely like trade food for things like sex and stuff like that. But in terms of just like sharing food, Homo sapiens, or the Homo genus is theoretically, that's like something that is a signature of our species. And so I think that that's like one of those central things. So I think that's a really cool idea of, yeah, if you're going to have a game night or something, to have like a seasonal food. That's fucking awesome. Love it.
One of my peak gaming experiences, I was doing a historical King Arthur campaign, and we were into the part where they were having a hard time on the military campaign. And this was in what is now East Anglia, what was once upon a time the territory of the Iceni. And they were eating a lot of rabbits. I served rabbit stew to everybody. And
Mm.
actually, my wife was playing the historical analog of Morgan Le Fay, and she didn't want to eat the rabbit stew because she didn't want to eat the cute rabbits. And the thing that came up in the story was the Morgan character having her connection to older British paganism was noting that the rabbit was connected with the Icenian goddess of victory. So as long
Hmm.
as the army was eating all of the rabbits, she was saying that the Iceni goddess of victory was denying them victory so long as they were eating all of the rabbits. And so, but then there was also the physical layer of they were suffering rabbit starvation. And
Mm.
so the solution was that they needed to go hunt a bear and to serve up the bear fat to the group, which
Mm-hmm.
is a cure for rabbit sickness
Mm-hmm.
for rabbit starvation, but could also be seen as the offering to the local spirit of victory as like a compensation or a
Mm.
apology.
Mm.
Uh, but the fact that we were playing this while we all had the taste of rabbit stew in our mouths,
Yeah. Yeah.
it really brought together the whole thing as a multi sensory experience.
Yeah. That's awesome. It makes me think of the sort of, there's generating the stories and then there's the application, right? Or the
Yeah.
how it takes shape in the real world and like the layering. And so I think that the example of seeing the place, like that it's a real place, you travel by it, it makes you think of the story. If the story itself then has like moralistic qualities or some sort of, you know, that's how the Apache place name stories specifically, they were all like the morals and ethics of
Right.
Apache society, and all of the stories could be told in 5 minutes or less. They were all connected to a place. So literally, like you had a mirror, like mirror neurons of the environment
Mm-hmm.
in the brain with the social etiquette of being an Apache. And
Right.
just like that amount of layering, like, and I've been thinking about this a lot too, because in our youth programs and stuff at Rewild Portland, like generating what I tell a story about a raccoon, Ricky the raccoon. Alliteration makes it easier for the kids to remember, but
Yeah.
it's basically like I want to like inspire the kids to be independent. I want to prepare them for potential aspects of the future. And so how do I do it? By like minimizing the impacts of those things and without like freaking them out. And so it's just sort of like a cast of colorful characters of, different animals, and they all interact or whatever. Um, and the main thing I don't have there is, so if I want to like imbue a moral, if I see some kids doing something and I'm like, these kids need to know this lesson, I'm gonna sit down and do a story about Ricky the raccoon, and I'm just like improv, so I
Mm-hmm.
can just like tell a story at random. My dad did this as a child, so I kind of got that ability from him, I think. But I'll just like go into a story, and it's what's so funny about it is that I'm not that I'm decent at it. I'll give myself credit, but also like it doesn't really matter with kids
Right.
or adults. Like I'll be like telling the story and I'm just making it up as I go, and like everybody's like sitting there wrapped, like what's going to happen next, and I like to do cliffhangers and whatever, and it's just really cool to see the impact of just any story. Like people, we're just like attuned to hearing things, especially because we tell them around a campfire, so we've got like
Right.
our campfire going, and there's other elements of it too, but it's just on those long winter days, it's really nice to have a moralistic distraction in the tale of a raccoon going on some sort of adventure where they have to collect seashells from an ocean otter, to a sea
Yeah.
otter, to like trade with the mountain beaver back here, and like introducing animals that they don't know maybe even exist because they haven't seen them. Um, anyway.
And that raises an important point about the play of it, because here I am talking about all these success stories. I'm not telling you about the 10,000 stories that went nowhere.
Right.
That play opens up an
Mm-hmm.
area for experimentation.
Yeah.
You try out some ideas, and you take, and it's not that every single game session is going to be the seed of some grand myth that will be honored by generations yet to
Mm-hmm.
come.
Mm-hmm.
But you're trying things out, and you're going to get some good ones out of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a practice which, when you repeat it, does start to yield results, and it yields results. It's an intentional, deliberate practice that will yield those results orders of magnitude more quickly
Mm-hmm.
than the natural unconscious processes that are going to happen regardless.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, it's not like this is the only way to generate oral tradition. We're going to generate oral tradition. We're humans. It's inevitable. This is a way to make it happen faster, because we are at a point where we have lost one of the most important things that any human culture can have, but we also have an engine for getting it back more powerful than any of us could have hoped for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. Um, I want to touch just a little bit on alternate reality games and then get your like, tips for listeners in terms of like, making their own stories or doing some sort of,
Yeah,
for lack of a better term, gamification of
sure.
their place. But when I think of there's different aspects or even levels of storytelling. And I think the first time I ever saw anything that I recognized as like a alternate reality game was that movie with Bill Murray called The Man Who Knew Too Little. I don't know if you've seen it. Classic Bill Murray. But basically his brother sends him onto a live action theater thing, kind of like Tony and Tina's wedding or something, where you're like involved with the cast or whatever.
Hmm.
And he's supposed to listen for this payphone call. The payphone is going to tell him what to do, and that's the first scene of the like story that he's then going to be playing out. But
Right.
simultaneously, there's an assassin who's waiting to get a phone call from that same phone booth, and the assassin gets it first and then goes into the theater company thing, and Bill Murray gets the assassin's phone call, and it's just like insanity ensues from there forth, right? But um I really like the idea of alternate reality games because I feel like it's a way of like stepping it up even more. Like it seems like is way more involved in terms of the physicality of place. And so I'm curious, like, if you've ever thought of doing, essentially it's like even more like there's tabletop, there's live action, and then alternate
Right.
reality. I feel like it's almost a progression in terms of like the level of intensity and
Hmm.
connection. I don't know if that's true, if that rings true for you, but have you ever thought of doing, or have you ever done any of the alternate reality stuff with the Fifth World?
I I have an ambition. We haven't done it yet, but I have an ambition of one day advancing the fifth world far enough that we can set up an immersive LARP where you go away to live in a fifth world village for a week.
That would be
And
amazing.
maybe we get to the point where people just go off to live in a fifth world LARP and they just don't come back.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's kind of what Lynx's Stone Age immersion program is, not Fifth World, but like,
Right.
when I did Lynx's program, I was like, this is live action role playing, you
Yeah.
know. And it was a criticism on one hand, but also like a revelation and inspiration on the other. Like I wasn't um some people might interpret that as like a diss or something, calling it that, but it's not. It was more of like recognizing the reality for what it was,
Right.
rather than some sort of the rhetoric around it. This is not really an indigenous group. This is not
Yeah.
really this thing. These are people playing dress up in ancestral clothes, enacting this thing. And the difference between us and the backpackers that were out in the mountains were our clothing that we had handmade, and our intentions with the place, which are huge, right? But we
Right.
were still playing in that sense.
Sure. One of my big motivations with the Fifth World was I used to write a lot of academic papers about rewilding and the critique of civilization, and it got to the point where I would put this in front of somebody, and I would get to the point where they agreed with me, and they said, "Yeah, that's all true. It's really depressing."
Yeah.
What? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
I just told you every form of oppression and tyranny and exploitation is going to end, has to end, has no future. An egalitarian society where we all work a couple hours a day and there's no coercion is inevitable. And you're saying that's depressing because ultimately that perception is so deeply embedded in our minds that hunter gatherer life must be a life of privation
Totally. Yeah.
and suffering, that even when you hear the evidence, it just kind of pings off. Like
Mm-hmm.
you'll accept each
Mm-hmm.
detail, but you won't put the details together into a new perception.
Totally.
And I realized that's because academic arguments can't make this impact. This can convince you of the details, but it can't change how you feel. To change how you feel, we need art. And
Totally.
that's where I start to fantasize about the LARP
Mm.
because you
Mm.
can get to that point of playing the tabletop game and being, putting yourself into this pseudo utopian future. You can see the how it feels a little bit, and then when you go LARP it for a week, you feel like, oh shit, this is actually really nice.
Totally.
I like this, um, and that will change your perspective of what kind of future you want. Even if you go home from the LARP, okay, fine. I would prefer if you had run off into the woods forever, but if you come home, you
Yeah.
can still take that and change the way that you look at the world and change the things that you do, the things you advocate for, the things you stand for, to move the world in a direction that makes that more possible
Mm-hmm.
for more people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. So what tips or advice, three or four bullet point things
The
would you have to share in terms of like get people who wanted to start doing more storification of their place?
The single most important thing that I have noticed, that I have found in building games, is the power of a question, which is easy to overlook because we ask so many questions. It's easy to underestimate how powerful they really are, especially for building a story that's more than just your story and it's more than just my story. It's our story, and it comes from both of us. Because when you ask the question, you're really doing a lot of framing by which questions you ask and how you phrase them, and you're definitely leaving your imprint on what comes next. But you're also leaving it open for the other person to fill in. And so when you ask a question, it's not just, it can sound like it's them filling in the story, but it's really not. What comes out is half yours and half theirs. And that really relates to something that Avery Alder wrote in her game Monster Hearts, where one of the principles is to keep the story feral. So it's not your story, it's not my story, it's the story that could only exist between us here and now. It couldn't be, if there was somebody else here, it would be a different story. If we told it a different day, it would be a different story. If we were in a different place, it would be a different story. But this story can only exist here because we're the ones who are here. We're the ones who are engaged with it. And we don't want to, and she talks about domesticating the story by trying to force it down the path that you think it should go. I think
Sounds
that,
familiar.
right?
Yeah.
And especially you can think of, like you mentioned about how winter is the storytelling season for Indigenous folks in your part of the world. I know the Anishinaabe in the Great Lakes have the same idea that it's dangerous or offensive or rude to tell stories during the summer or fall or spring, because those stories involve people who are awake and around, and they may take offense. You tell stories during the winter because they're all asleep, and so you can tell stories. But there's also the idea that the stories themselves are alive. And you think of the way that, if you take that animist idea of the story as a person, it makes a lot of sense. The way that stories possess us and animate us. You can think of a lot of the worst things going on in the world as people who are possessed by bad stories. And so the treating the story that is coming out of you as a living thing that you are giving birth to, that you are creating in this moment together, and allowing it the freedom and really giving it the respect it deserves as an animist person, that you want to respect its autonomy and follow where it leads rather than decide that you know where it's going to go.
I'm thinking of well, yeah, why don't you tell people how they can get involved with the Fifth World too?
All right. So with the Fifth World, we have a Patreon, and I would love your support. It's mostly for paying the upkeep costs. There is a website. It's invite only, but if you reach out to me, it is not hard to get an invite to the Fifth World. Just show me that you understand what we're getting at. It's just, most people don't get what our goal is, and when you're a member of the Fifth World, you can edit anything and everything. So we don't want to open that up to people who just don't get the rewilding vibe at all. But if you make any contribution, like write a short story, make a tweet that is like a little micro fiction of the Fifth World, draw a picture, anything at all, just send it to us. We have a Twitter. I haven't checked the Twitter account for a while, so don't send by Twitter. Send it to web@thefifthworld.com, and I will get you an invitation. That will also get you into our Discord. It has, honestly, it's been a little dead, and I'm working on some new software to run the whole thing right now. But hey, we could be one new person away from things really igniting and turning off. Like there's people in there, just everybody's real shy and quiet. So one mouthy person could be enough to really light the fire.
Nice. Awesome. Well, this was great. I feel like this is a line of thought I'm in kind of recircling back around 20 years later. And I'm going to do an interview as well with an improvisational teacher for improvisational theater that's kind of related to this, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, a lot of the practical things of improv are really foundational. Like, how do you let the story stay feral? It's yes and
Totally.
all of the basic improv techniques.
Yeah. So I'm going to try to do something like that too, which I feel will also give people some elements of more tools for the tool bag in terms of connecting through story and wildness, really. Yeah. Thank you, Jason, for coming on the show. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rewilding podcast. Please check the show notes to connect with my guest and for a list of resources that we mentioned in our conversation. If this episode inspired you, made you think more deeply, or gave you some new tools to use, make sure to subscribe and become a patron at patreon.com/PeterMichaelBauer. If you're new to rewilding or want to expand your perception of it, I recommend attending one of my Rewilding 101 workshops, which I offer both in person in Portland, Oregon, and online via Zoom for those who live around the world. You can check upcoming dates and register at rewildportland.com. Thanks for listening.